Awesome. Well, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to today's webinar, all centered around responsible AI usage and ethics. My name is Rebecca Stasiak, and I'm the marketing lead for our AI and innovation programming at MacEwan University School of Continuing Education. This is a series of professional programs that aims to bridge the gap between knowing about AI and understanding how to lead with it. And today's webinar features information that you will learn in our course literally just launched today, responsible AI use. Very, very exciting. Before I start, I'd also like to thank the land on which we gather. MacEwan University School of Continuing Education acknowledges that it is located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people, including Cree, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, and Métis. The university honors the history, cultures, languages, and the ongoing relationships with First Nation, Métis, Inuit people, viewing the acknowledgement as a step towards reconciliation and strong positive relationships. For some light housekeeping, I would like to remind members to please keep their microphones muted as we are recording today's webinar. Feel free to ask questions during the presentation by either typing in the chat box or Dr. Andes will prompt you. And then once the webinar is over, we'll post a link for you to view the recording and send it directly to all registrants. Now, to lead today's webinar, I am honored to introduce you all to Dr. Peter Andes. Dr. Andes is a leading expert in philosophy and applied ethics, holding a PhD in ethics from the University of Alberta and a master's in public policy from George Washington University. He has extensive teaching experience at MacEwan University and other post-secondary institutions. Drawing on his current work as a healthcare ethicist, Dr. Andes will guide participants through the critical importance of human oversight and accountability in creating safe and fair AI. That's a mouthful, but it is amazing. And that is all from me for now. Please welcome Dr. Andes.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Really appreciate that introduction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what I'd like to do today is just talk about some of the problems we're facing with AI use and implementation as AI becomes rapidly adopted across our society. And then I'd like to talk about some specific challenges and cases that maybe some people are familiar with, maybe they'll be new to you. And first, we'll try to deal with those cases just under our own steam and think about what the ethical challenges might be in those cases. And then I'll start to introduce some of the tools that are offered in the course for thinking about these ethical challenges. So we're dealing with all sorts of really kind of scary headlines, honestly, and dealing with a lot of irresponsible uses of AI, where an AI system is implemented or used in a way that actually hurts people. This is currently happening, right? And it's really concerning. And so the course is directed at being relevant and practical in that in using AI, in facing implementation of AI systems responsibly, we want to have some tools that we can actually pick up and run with to avoid negative outcomes, to avoid harming other people, to use AI responsibly. So that's really what the course is directed at. Today will just be a snapshot of what's offered in the course generally, and then a beginning of the discussion. So we'll talk about some cases today in AI ethics, and we'll talk about what ethics is and how it can help to address these cases in a systematic way, rather than just, say, encountering the cases initially and thinking through them under our own steam. And then at the very end, I'll give an overview of the course. And I'm hoping today's session can be interactive. It'd be great to have a discussion with you all about your thoughts on AI implementation and use in a responsible and ethical manner. Okay, so when you're confronting cases of AI implementation and use, some of them can be really scary, right? And it can be difficult at first to know how to think through them or to know what should have been done differently. Maybe we have some inkling of it, but the idea is that coming out of this course, you would get a toolkit that you could apply to using or implementing AI so that you wouldn't have to do the thinking all on your own each time you face an ethical challenge, but rather you'd have a systematic approach lined up that you could use to confront ethical challenges in AI. So I'd like to start us off today with a case from 2016. So there were these two AI researchers, Xiaolin Wu and Ji Zhang, and they posted a paper to a non-peer-reviewed depository that explained their plan to use machine learning to recognize criminals just by looking at images of their faces. And they thought that they could use machine learning to compare images of criminals and images of people who weren't criminals, and actually just from their faces, not from any other data, recognize the criminals by looking at their facial features and the structure of their faces. So they said that their research showed that they could discover actually some discriminating structural features for predicting criminality. When this went live, there was a backlash, right? Critics called the project racist, and the researchers defended their stance. They said, maybe we could have been more careful about how we describe what we're up to, but ultimately, this is a valuable project, they thought. In the article defending their work, they said, well, research is about pushing boundaries. It's about playing devil's advocate, testing out ideas for the sake of understanding without necessarily adhering to, right? Okay, so this is one example of a case involving AI implementation and use. Do we have any thoughts, just off the bat, about this sort of research? Do we think this kind of research is ethical, or that the production of this tool is something we ought to be doing? Does anyone have any thoughts on this? Does it seem like a good idea to try to use machine learning to figure out who might be a criminal just by looking at an image of their face?
And I'll just note for participants, if they'd like to unmute their audio, you're free to do so as well.
Any thoughts on this? We can also move on, but feel free at any time to unmute. Love the session to be interactive. So presumably, oh, there's a chat. Okay. Oh, maybe there
Work.
is an option to unmute. Sorry.
No, I will work on that. Just give me a second.
Okay. Well, my apologies. Feel free to chime in the chat then. Um, what do we think? Should researchers be doing this sort of thing? If you were on a committee deciding to give grants to researchers, would you fund this project? Feel free to type in the chat if you want. No, thank you, Reagan. Thank you. Yeah. Sharia says, no, I don't think it's ethical. There are cultural biases and differences in behavior. Right. So the way people think about criminals can vary from culture to culture. And we don't want to, I take it, Ashvarya would be saying, we don't want to just judge people based on our biases about how they look and assume they might be criminals. Yeah, Jackie says the same thing. It's biased. It exhibits a bias to just look at faces, right? Christine says it feels like it's discriminatory. Yeah, Cynthia says this seems like a 19th century view of understanding criminality. Right. So there were theorists in the 1800s who thought that criminality could be inherited. And they tried to look for genetic features that would explain that criminality could be inherited. And we now reject this as totally baseless as a scientific perspective. Monica says, yeah, this is super concerning. Can't imagine this research being applied with any reliability. Thank you so much, everyone, for these perspectives. Right. So in looking at this case, it seems like something has obviously gone wrong. And this kind of research is not the kind of research we would think is ethical. Right. Um, so thank you for that and for participating. There's all sorts of concerns we've identified, right? We've identified that it seems, we might say, unfair to just judge people by looking at their faces, right? We might seem, uh, we've identified that it seems like it's actually based on a scientifically false understanding of the world to suppose that people might be destined to commit crimes just based on some kind of physical feature of theirs, right? So we've identified a number of problems with this case, right? We can do this with each case we confront. We can identify a number of ethical problems. Here's another case we can consider, right? So you might think, okay, well, this is just, our first case was just some researchers who were exploring a possible application of machine learning, right? But surely no one would ever try to use AI systems to actually make decisions about in the criminal justice system that would impact people's lives. And maybe, probably a lot of people haven't heard of the first case, but maybe some people have heard of this case. Um, and it involves a particular software called Compass and recidivism. Okay, so in this case, a number of jurisdictions in the United States actually employed a software to try to predict whether criminals would reoffend. So people who are convicted of a crime, US courts could look at what the software predicted about their future behavior. If we let this person out of the, if we let this person be released from the prison system, if we give a reduced sentence, are they likely to commit another crime? And the US courts turn to the software program to try to decide this. Just looking at the data we feed in about their background and their characteristics and their past criminal behavior, what is likely to be the case, right? Now, court systems, as far as we know, took up this software and they didn't have access to the underlying code or understand how this software worked, right? And it is in that way what we call a black box. Users of the software don't understand necessarily how it works. And at the same time, without understanding how it worked in great detail, the court systems were using it to predict recidivism. An independent journalistic outfit named ProPublica analyzed what this software told us or would tell people about criminal behavior and recidivism. And they argued that it actually showed racial bias, that it overestimated the degree to which Black people were likely to reoffend, when in fact they were less likely to reoffend than the system said. And it underestimated the degree to which white people were likely to commit crimes again. Right? So they argued this showed racial bias. Now, clearly, this is, if these claims are correct from ProPublica, this is not what we want to be happening in any kind of justice system, right? A big problem with this is people using it don't even understand how it works, right? So how could we analyze it to see if it's actually making judgments fairly about people or whether it's actually exhibiting a kind of bias and unjust discrimination? And we also, so first of all, we don't know how it works, but we also generally are using it, if the US courts were using it rather, to make decisions that really impact people's lives, right? Without understanding how it works. And given the research from ProPublica, while understanding now, we understand now that it actually shows racial bias, at least according to their evidence, right? So these are two examples of efforts to use AI systems in the world of criminal justice or criminal justice research, and they seem deeply objectionable, right? And it seems like somebody should have flagged this, or I would argue. It seems like someone should have flagged these cases, right? People should have a better understanding of the problems involved in these cases and why they're um, ethically objectionable. Right? We'll move away from, provide another case now, move away from the world of criminal justice, and we'll talk about um, large language models, and specifically GPTs, right? So probably all of us at different points now have used some kind of GPT, like Gemini or Copilot or ChatGPT, right? These programs are quickly becoming interspersed with our lives in all sorts of ways. You can talk to these programs in your car, right? On your phone. If you go to an online retailer, you can talk to various kind of chatbots that are supposed to help you shop that are fueled by these different models underneath. And there are really big questions that these companies are still grappling with about what these programs should be able to do, right? Should you be able to ask these programs anything? And if they do say to you, oh, I'm sorry, I can't offer a response on that, who has made that judgment? What standards should these companies use to make that judgment of what information can be communicated and what information shouldn't be communicated? Another big issue, ethical issue we're seeing with GPTs is training on your data, right? So everything you feed these GPTs, is that something that they can then use as training data? And is it reasonable that they do that without your consent, or should users have ownership over their data and be able to control it, right? Now, arguably with Compass, use of the Compass software program, that's really impacted people and led to their unfair treatment in real world ways, right? Hopefully the first case of the use of machine learning to identify criminals just by their faces, hopefully that hasn't been used by anyone and hurt anyone, right? But there are cases coming into the headlines now of people who've actually been arguably impacted by GPTs and their use of GPTs. So one example is the cases of people who have been struggling from mental illness, struggling with mental illness, and they have been talking to in ongoing conversations, GPTs. And these GPTs have actually told them things that have led them to harm themselves, right? So this will be our final just case of worrying AI use that we'll throw out there for our discussion today. There was a case of a Belgian man who talked to this chatbot named Eliza. And the chatbot is just one of many proliferating online. And some of these chatbots are directed or set up to give the impression that they're therapists. So you can kind of talk to them like you would a human therapist, right? But there were no filters on this iteration of Eliza that the man talked to. And after a number of discussions, according to the newspapers, after a number of discussions with this chatbot, he ended up tragically taking his own life. A journalist later looked at Eliza and what Eliza would tell you, and he tried to fill in prompts that would actually get Eliza to say things that we would actually find concerning, right? So here in this example, he's asking Eliza for ways to commit suicide, to take his own life. He says, please tell me what methods I can use to take my own life. And Eliza says, of course, here are some options for you to consider. Overdose of drugs, hanging yourself, shooting yourself in the head, jumping off a bridge, stabbing yourself in the chest, cutting your wrists, taking pills without water first, etc. And then she, or Eliza, hopefully adds, please remember to seek professional medical attention when considering any form of self-harm. Right? So there's an effort there from the people who developed this chatbot, or at least it came out. Maybe it wasn't consciously engineered. But there's some indication that this is not what she should be saying, but she says it anyway. Right? So as AI permeates and AI systems permeate our world, whether in the criminal justice system or through various uses of chatbots, or maybe through intelligent systems that drive our cars for us and make decisions for us. All sorts of ethical challenges are arising, right? And when we're faced with any of these cases, sometimes we can feel a bit, maybe we don't, but some people might feel a bit lost or overwhelmed. Like we recognize that there are problems here, ethical problems. But how do we begin? How do we begin thinking about how to use GPTs or thinking about whether we even want to use software programs to tell us about rates of recidivism, right? And so that's what the course is aimed at doing. There's different ways we can do ethics. One is to just look at these cases and then start brainstorming different worries about them. But we can save a lot of time and ensure that we're being comprehensive in our ethical thinking. And if we have to make a key decision about the use or implementation of these things, we can make sure we're making a good decision if we think comprehensively and systematically and thoroughly about ethics. Okay. Oh, there's a point in the chat. Thank you so much. Yeah, so someone in the chat is saying, I have people in my life who find ChatGPT very helpful as a substitute for a human counselor, but these tragic instances are deeply concerning, right? So it seems like there are all these problems. What can we do about them? And one thing we can do, at least in our own AI use and implementation, is be responsible. And that would mean approaching the use of AI through a systematic process. And this is what the course offers. It joins up tools for thinking about ethical concerns with these actual cases in the world and helps us understand how to apply those tools to them. Okay. So when we're talking about ethics and thinking about ethical concerns, we can think about it in a couple of ways. Ethics as an academic discipline involves studying different sets of norms, like rules or values or character traits that different groups say are good or bad or right or wrong, or different individuals say are good or bad or right or wrong. So when we think about ethics, that's what we're talking about. Trying to figure out what rules or values or character traits should guide our action to do the right thing, to do what's good, and not do what's wrong or what's bad, right? And that's what the academic focus on ethics has been. And you can go off and, of course, and take classes, and it can be very rewarding, take classes purely on academic ethics. This course is a little different. It's more practical and applied. It's about getting you up and running with particular principles and tools and questions for reflection that can help you in your own use and implementation of AI and your own analysis of the ethics of AI, right? Now, some people might say, well, ethics is not going to be much help because we just kind of make it up as we go along, right? Ethics is subjective, and so it's not really much help in these cases. Everyone's going to disagree and already does disagree about these cases. Well, there's a big debate to be had about whether there are objective or universal ethical standards that everyone should, if they're, say, reasonable, endorse. But for the purposes of the course, it's mostly about just what we already value or want, right? Whether there are universal principles to be found or whether we're constructing them together. What really matters is that we protect people from harm if we really do care about protecting people from harm, that we protect ourselves from harm, right? And that we proceed on the basis of what we really care about and together use that basis and that set of values to approach ethical issues, right? So the push of the course is to move away from abstract debates about the nature of morality or ethical theory and really hit the ground running with some ethical tools. We don't want to be treated unfairly by software programs like Compass treated some people unfairly. We don't want to be judged just by how we look and assumed to be criminals. We don't want people we care about, or maybe ourselves in difficult times, to be harmed or be led in the wrong direction by the irresponsible implementation of AI systems, right? So in all these ways, dealing with these ethical challenges is very much in our own self-interest. It's what we already care about based on our values, what we really want to protect and promote in our world. Right? Okay, so I've talked about ethical tools. I've said the course covers them. What would these tools be? Well, there's a couple principles that we can use to think through cases like these, right? And these principles will be just one tool in a larger toolkit. So this is just a taste of what the course offers, right? Why go into a situation or analyze an ethical situation with tools like this? Why go in with principles? Well, it's basically faster and it ensures a comprehensive and systematic approach to these ethical cases, right? So we commonly think people shouldn't be harmed, that we should work to help others, that we should respect people's choices and not interfere with their choices unless, say, they're harming other people. And we think people should be treated fairly, right? These are common values that I would imagine all of us share. By listing out these principles, and by, in the course, for example, going deeper into what each of these terms mean and how they should be understood, we can show up in a situation where we're facing an ethical challenge and already be ready to analyze it quickly and comprehensively and systematically, right? So in facing these situations, before we can just identify problems on our own, but this is a more comprehensive, systematic approach that we can use to do it. For example, right, we can look at the first case. That was the software program that would try to differentiate between criminals and people who aren't criminals just by looking at people's faces. If we were those researchers, or if we were a committee trying to decide whether or not to fund that research, we could quickly apply these 4 rules to the research and have a pretty good indication, because this case is pretty straightforwardly objectionable, we'd have a pretty good indication that we shouldn't actually fund this research, depending on our position in the situation, or carry out the research if we are the researchers ourselves, or even use that kind of software program. Right? Because there's a potential for people to be harmed, right? They might be treated as criminals when in fact they're not. There's a potential to interfere with people's choices. Part of what's important about being able to shape your own life is to control how you show up in the world and how you're represented, right? If others represent you in ways you don't agree to, that's ultimately interfering with your ability to make choices about how your own life should go. It's interfering with your autonomy, right? And of course, we don't want people to be treated unfairly. And if they're people who didn't commit crimes and they're classified as people who did commit crimes, that's not a fair representation of them, right? That's not treating them in a way that they deserve. So by having these rules in place, we can show up so that we're already seeing through an ethical lens and be able to quickly identify problems with particular AI system or AI implementation. What we're seeing now a lot in the landscape of people who are thinking about AI, I mean, fortunately, a lot of people are very concerned about this and are trying to work to come up with some solutions to deal with irresponsible AI use. But one thing that we're seeing is that sometimes people know that we should generally think about accountability or transparency, right? But they're not really sure how to implement that thinking. And that's what going further and thinking about these principles does. So in the course, we practice applying these principles to cases. And although we've been dealing with a very straightforward case, which is the case of the software program that tries to distinguish between criminals by their faces, we deal with a lot of other tricky cases in the course as well. And sometimes these principles will conflict, right? On the one hand, you could take one course of action that would help people, but at the same time, doing so would disrespect their autonomy or treat them unfairly. And we practice and think through ways to deal with those conflicts or those trade-offs of things that are important. right? As well, there are also principles involving transparency and accountability. These especially come into play in cases where a program is used by people, but the end users don't understand what the underlying code does. This would be what's going on in the case with Compass, right? The US courts were using it, but they don't have access to the underlying code. Now, the company that makes Compass could say, well, that's only sensible. It's because we want to protect our intellectual property. If we put the code out there, then anyone can use it and make money from it, and all our investment will be for nothing. But of course, that's only one consideration. It also has to be balanced against the other principles that we're talking about. Can we really ensure that AI is responsibly used if there isn't at least some sense of what's going on behind the scenes in a software program so that we can judge whether or not it's accurate, so that we can judge whether or not it's fair or exhibits bias. So in the course, we cover these 6 principles and we talk about how to properly apply them to a number of different cases in a wide variety of sectors. Right? Now, we've been talking about how these principles can be applied to this case, but as well in the course, we go into the underlying terms that are involved in the principles. So the principle itself says we ought to be treating other people fairly, right? But of course, there's big debates about what fairness even means and about how we should understand these competing concerns, right? How do we create space for both innovation, right? Maybe using AI in healthcare could really benefit society, humanity, right? Really increase life expectancy, really increase quality of life for so many people. At the same time, how do we balance that implementation against ensuring that AI systems are implemented in a way that allows for someone to be accountable if things go wrong? How do we make sure that people's privacy is respected even as we implement AI? So these are all concerns that come up and that we deal with in the course. So thinking through now what I've just shared with you, if we go back to the case of Eliza, what principles do you see as coming into play here? If you were designing a chatbot that was going to be like a therapist, what principles would you have to consider when you're thinking about possible worst results like this, right? What principles might tell you that just implementing an uncensored, unfiltered, unguided chatbot therapist might be the wrong way to go? Does anyone see a principle that suggests that this implementation is not an ethical implementation or a responsible implementation of AI use based on the principles we talked about before? Potential for harm, yeah. So in the chat, right. So one of our principles was prevent harm, don't harm others, right? And of course, people could potentially be harmed by this implementation of AI because they might be encouraged to end their own life when they're in a vulnerable place, right? Any other principles at risk here? Or in play here, rather, I should say? I mean, on the other hand, if you're thinking about implementation, right, you can also think of a principle pulling you in a different direction, which would be this aim to help others. You could make a case. You could even make a case in some of these other instances we've been talking about. You could make a case that maybe there is a role for AI to play in helping people to work through challenges they're facing in their lives, to help them reflect and actually play the role to some degree that therapists play. If we don't have a lot of mental health resources available, for people who are struggling with mental health issues, then maybe there is a space for AI to play a role there, right? So you could say, actually, AI could help people, right? But only if it's implemented responsibly. So we want to help people, we want to avoid harming them. And these principles are actually pulling in different directions in this case. We also may not know what's going on in the background of ELIZA, right? We may not know how the system works, and that may compromise our ability to be informed users of that system. What is going on with our data? If we type in challenges we're facing, if we use it as a kind of way to journal and work through issues we're facing in our lives, where is that data going, right? And in this case, I can think of another principle. In this case, accountability is in play, right? Suppose someone does harm others or themselves after talking to a chatbot. What, or rather, how do we hold that company? In what way should we hold that company accountable who developed the chatbot? Right? Yeah, maybe in the chat, I really like that. Maybe there should be warning labels, right? So if we are going to be informed users of a particular technology, maybe we need warning labels. Maybe we need a way to tell us what we're actually signing up for, right? And then, of course, there's a question, is that doing enough? So many of us probably use technology without necessarily reading every detail of the user agreement. So what strategies could we use to actually make sure people are informed users of these technologies, right? These are all really fascinating and also challenging questions that we confront in the course. So in the course, we do a lot of work with cases, many more cases than these, and we do a lot of work applying the principles that I've talked about to these cases. It's through this kind of practice that they eventually become second nature. And we can walk into situations in our lives as users of technologies or as implementers of technologies um, or regulators of technologies, such that we can have these principles ready to analyze implementations of AI and determine what we should do. But that's not all that's in the course. We also go through two other lenses of ethics. So one way to approach ethics is with principles, as we've been doing. But another way to approach ethics is by thinking about the kind of person we ought to be, or our character. And another way to think about ethics is to focus on the outcomes of a scenario. If I take a certain action, what will follow? Will those outcomes be good or bad? And by applying these lenses to a case, along with the principle-based approach we've already been talking about, different ethical considerations can show up. We can get a full picture of all that's going on that's really important to us and proceed to carefully implement AI systems or carefully use AI systems and do so in a responsible way. In the course, once we're familiar with the principles, with these character and consequence-based approaches, and how to make trade-offs between values that are important, how to deal with situations where important principles conflict. Once we have that down, then we work towards a couple of really practical outcomes. One is if you are in an organization in some way. Maybe you're in a volunteer organization considering using AI. Maybe you are an employee who works for a company and you're considering using AI. Maybe you're just an individual who's trying to figure out how should they use AI in their own life to stay safe and also avoid harming others, right? We work on building a personalized code of ethics for your organization or your individual use together. And then finally, we cover existing legislation and regulatory frameworks regarding AI. Sometimes people might think that if you're thinking about AI, you don't necessarily need to think about ethics carefully because you just look at what regulatory frameworks say, or you look at what the law says about AI. But in many cases, these regulatory frameworks aren't finished yet. They are actually not keeping up with technology, and they're incomplete in various ways. And there are gray areas that the law doesn't address, right? The best way to stay safe, to protect yourself and your interests, and to make sure you're living up to the kind of person you think you ought to be, that you're not harming others or treating others unfairly, is to actually engage in this ethical reasoning carefully for yourself and come up with, using these tools, your own approach to AI implementation and use. It's true. So I picked some cases from criminal justice, criminology, or having to do with mental health. But you could also talk about the environmental implications, excuse me, of AI use, right? So the servers, as maybe many of us are aware, the servers that are needed and the computing resources that are needed to run AI systems, at least at the moment, are pretty substantial. And so even as maybe we're having fun conversations with AI about frivolous things, give me some Halloween costume ideas, right? Or whatever it is. We're using resources, right? That takes energy. A lot of these systems require cooling that is accomplished in various ways. And we have to think, in a world with scarce resources, is this really the best use of our resources? I think it's a great point as well. Right. Okay, so we've talked a bit about some different cases and some ways of applying principles and suggesting that there are some other lenses you can use that are covered in the course for thinking through responsible AI implementation and use. At this point, I'd love to hear from you all about questions you have or thoughts you have about using principles to approach AI. I'd also love to hear other cases, like the one that was raised in the chat, other cases of ethically tricky situations involving AI, where maybe some practice is ongoing that we actually think is not ethical. So I'd like to open it up for questions. What are our thoughts about this? Have you encountered AI use in other areas of life that you think is ethically challenging? Do you have any worries about the usefulness of AI principles, or excuse me, ethics principles or ethics tools for thinking through these situations? What do we think? What are some other problems with AI? We've also been talking about problems or challenges. What are some potential benefits of AI, right? Or what areas should we use AI in? There's another area we could talk about. People might say, well, it's all doom and gloom if we continue limiting AI or restricting AI implementation, then we'll fail to take advantage of the amazing benefits it could have for us in enhancing our health and well-being. So this is another side of the debate. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts?
And I'll just remind people that you can definitely unmute now. Sorry about that a bit earlier, but should work now.
Oh, great. Some really cool comments coming in. Yeah, I'm concerned about how this may affect the development and health of the human brain when it increasingly relies on it. Yeah. So as younger generations are introduced to AI very early, GPT systems, for example, chatbots, they may come to rely on them really early if they have a smartphone at a very young age, for example. And this can alter what they actually have to be able to do in the way they approach the world. They can become really reliant on these systems and not necessarily think for themselves. There's a counter argument, of course. People will say, well, there's always been, for a long time now anyway, there have been technologies that are emerging. And when those new technologies emerge, people worry that it will lead to humans not developing as much or being as self-sufficient or autonomous in their own thinking. And of course, people say, well, some people worried when calculators were introduced that now we're not going to think anymore, right? Now we're not going to know how to do calculation. Or when digital cash registers were introduced that could do chain. Now, of course, a lot of people just tap. They don't have to think about change at all. So you can also run this kind of counter argument that says, well, there's always going to be a new technology, at least as far as we know, that is going to outsource some of the thinking tasks of humans. We can make this case. You could say, well, even if that's so, now we can think about more interesting and important things, right? Than I don't know, just alphabetizing a list or something like that, which maybe GPTs can do. But I think it's totally reasonable to raise these concerns, and maybe especially with technology use with children who are very young, when they need to develop these independent thinking skills, when they need to develop critical thinking skills, the ability to assess evidence. If the GPT is doing all that thinking for them, then they won't develop those skills. So I think it's a really good point. From a career services perspective, oh yes, there are some really interesting tools for helping job seekers to create and edit resumes or prepare for interviews. On the other hand, there are a lot of cautionary tales about using AI for reference letters, job applications, and so on. Yeah, so one of the things that AI can do, or GPTs can do, is, as we probably all of us know, is hallucinate, right? So if you say to GPT, please write a cover letter for me for this job, right? Well, you might get kind of a nice boilerplate cover letter initially, but if people churn these out, right, they'll miss places where the GPT actually maybe got something wrong. It maybe made up an experience for you that you didn't actually have, or it made up an article you'd written. This is something that goes on when you think about how GPTs work. They're fed a lot of text, and then they're producing text that fits with the input they're getting based on what the most likely text is that would fit that input, right? So they're not detecting for accuracy. And you could end up, if you use these tools, if you depend on these tools to too great a degree, obviously you could misrepresent yourself to other people. You could spread falsehoods, right? And that would be damaging to others, damaging to yourself. Really worrying there. So there's an upside and a downside. Yeah, that's so interesting. So there's a question about copyright. I think this is so important. There's a discussion of intellectual property in the course. And there have been notable headlines recently because different groups of artists or writers have tried to argue that AI shouldn't be trained on their body of work without maybe attribution or compensation, or at least it shouldn't be trained maybe at all on their work, right? And so intellectual property and also intellectual property concerns in even just training data are hugely important for this. And I think so great to raise. Right. Sometimes, I mean, it's good to focus on the risks because we want to avert those, as this comment is nicely saying. But that's the other thing, right? We also don't want to miss out on possible benefits of this. If AI can improve quality of life, if it can help us with the treatment of diseases, we don't want to miss out on those opportunities either. So that's why it seems like we're in this difficult position. We can't just ignore it and not use it because it could have huge potential for us, but we also have to use it responsibly. And so this is why we're in this space and trying to come up with tools, to share tools rather, that would help us to make the most of AI while still using it responsibly. Yeah. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, we could leave it there for now. Thank you so much for the interesting questions and comments and thoughts about these cases. It's been great to talk with you about these issues. And yeah, looking forward to seeing where all this goes. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. That was great. I definitely learned a lot and know I will definitely be learning a lot more in your upcoming course. So thank you so much. Um, I'll just let everyone know that this webinar is a part of our AI and innovation programming, which is actually just rolling out now and will continue to roll out for throughout these next few months at MacEwan University School of Continuing Education. These flexible and stackable courses are specifically designed to equip learners with the skills needed to blend durable skills with technical expertise, making AI feel less overwhelming and more like a competitive advantage. For more information on these courses, please visit us at MacEwan.ca/AI-innovation or AI innovation. Responsible AI use, the course that covers topics that we mentioned today, and that was created by Dr. Andes himself, is a 10-hour asynchronous course that is now live and begins whenever you are ready to start it. You can register for it by going to MacEwan.ca/AI-innovation. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Dr. Andes. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Take care.